Reaching Out for Animal Rights, Roar presents Sister Brother Animal. The following is a short from PETA, written and narrated by Robin Camille. Hope you enjoy.
My great-great-grandmother was a slave on a North Carolina plantation. Slavery was a horrible, ugly, and brutal system. Many rose up against the injustices of slavery and fought to free my people from bondage. And today I can stand here a free woman without chains or shackles on my hands and feet. Slavery is still a reality for some. Every year, hundreds of animals are stolen from their homes to be sold to marine parks and zoos where they are abused and held captive until the day they die, never seeing their families again. When you buy a ticket to SeaWorld, Ringling Brothers Circus, your local zoo or aquarium, you are an active participant in this modern-day slave trade. Let us all stand up and fight for the freedom of animals in captivity. Let's end slavery everywhere, anywhere, in all its forms, for all living beings.
My guest for this interview is Jim Mason, who wrote the book An Unnatural Order: The Roots of Our Domination and Destruction of Nature and Each Other. Jim Mason is an author, a public speaker, a journalist, a lawyer, and a major figure in advocating for animal liberation, animal rights. Thank you so much, Jim Mason, for doing this. I'm so excited to have an interview with you after reading this book, An Unnatural Order, and thoroughly enjoying it and learning mind-blowing stuff all the time. Welcome and thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Why don't we dive right in, and perhaps you can give us some background, who you are, when and where you were born, your early life, your schooling, your social activism, and your meeting Peter Singer.
I was born September 1940 in Superior, Wisconsin, where my dad was the publisher of a newspaper. And about a year later, World War II broke out, Pearl Harbor, and my parents decided within a few months to move out of the city and move to Southwest Missouri, where the rest of their family lived, in Springfield. And my mother's hometown was Mount Vernon, Missouri. So they decided to buy a small farm there. So by the spring of 1942, when I'm an infant, 18 months old or something, we all moved to the new farm that they'd bought near Mount Vernon, Missouri, with my mom and my dad and aunt and uncle and grandparents. And we all lived in this big farmhouse on 160 acres of land. And I barely remember that move. I have one vague memory. It's kind of only an emotional memory. It's a feeling that somehow life had changed suddenly and drastically, and that life was much harder now. Life was not as comfortable. There were stresses. And I think that's because the move was into an old farmhouse that had no heat. My mother cooked on a wood stove. It was a primitive situation for a baby. So that's where it all started. And from then on, we farmed in that very same place until I left to go to college in about 1958.
Thank you. I've read and seen other aspects of your life, including your family raising animals and the chores you had to do and the impact that had on your life, especially certain particular traumatic events. Would you care to go into that?
I had two older brothers, and with my dad, we had to go to the barn every morning and do what we called the chores, which consisted of feeding and watering the animals. And the animals consisted mainly of some dairy cows. I think we had about 10 or 12 milk cows. We had maybe 60 or 70 cows of the cattle of the beef breed, that is, the animals that were slaughtered for meat. We had a flock of chickens, we had geese, we had ducks, we had every kind of critter. So in the morning, even as a little kid, before I started school, I went to the barn with my dad and my brothers. And because I was so little, they had me do some of the odd chores while they milked by hand the milk cows. My chores consisted of spreading some grain for the dairy cows to eat, because when you milk cows, their heads are in a thing called a stanchion, which kind of holds them in place while you milk them. And in front of them is a trough where the feed goes. So my job was to go along with a bucket and dump feed in the trough. So the milk cows would be eating grain while they milked them. And another chore that they assigned me to do was to go behind the cows and scoop up the poop that they left in the barn. I was introduced to that part of farm work early on. And later on, when I was old enough to go to school, we had to do all of that and be cleaned up and change clothes and ready to go to school by 8 o'clock in the morning. So it was pretty busy morning. And of course, when we got out of school and my dad got home from work in the evening, we had to do all of that all over again because you had to milk the cows twice a day. And in the wintertime, you had to pitch out hay and fodder for the beef cows. So that was the basic daily work of farming. And then, of course, the rest of the year, there was a lot of other work, such as cutting and putting up hay in the barn, doing repairs to the fencing. Some of the work, if you call it that, that bothered me the most as I got older, it was some of the cruel things that we had to do to animals. And one of the incidents that was most shocking to me, and I wrote about it in my book, and I usually choke up when I tell about it. I think I was about 5 years old, and one morning, I guess it was, I believe I sensed a commotion outside the porch where I was playing. So being a 5-year-old, I had to open the door and go see what was going on. And first thing I saw, and it's still vivid in my memory, was a wash tub full of bloody heads of dead pigs. And then the next thing I remember seeing was I looked up and I saw the bodies of the pigs hanging from a big branch of the big oak tree in the yard. Then my memory stops, and I'm told years later by my mother that I had I'd gone hysterical, and I guess I blacked out. That's why I don't remember anything more. I guess it was a traumatic experience. My mom tells me years later that they had to take me to town, that I wouldn't calm down, and they had to take me to her sister's house while they finished the butchering of the pigs. And after several days, I still didn't want to come back home. I was afraid to come back to the farm. But eventually they persuaded me to come back home, and somehow, year in and year out, I participated in the other farm chores. Many more incidents that are similar to that. That was probably the most shocking. I think another one, I must have been 12 years old, 10 or 12. And I was assumed to be old enough to go out to the corral and help my father and brothers and uncle do what they call working the calves. And this is what you do in the springtime before fly time, is you castrate and dehorn the calves of the beef animals. So I knew what was going to happen. And as I was climbing over the fence to go with my brothers and my dad and my uncle said to me, "Stop crying and straighten up and act like a man, or we'll send you back to the house with the girls," meaning my mother and her sister and the farm wives. So I had obviously another emotional trauma, anticipating the pain and the suffering that we were going to cause to these calves, because I'd seen it before, but I hadn't been up close and personal. I wasn't required to participate in it. But this was the day, the coming of age of the farm kid becoming, quote unquote, a man and doing this really horrible work. And I suppose I went ahead and had to do it because of the peer pressure. And the values of the farm culture tell you that these things are necessary. You don't have a choice. So that was another incident, but there were so many more. And practically every year there was something similar, right up until the time I left that farm life to go to college in St. Louis. I was 17 years old. So I really did have a childhood of really traumatic incidents involving sometimes participating in really great cruelty to animals.
And did your father say anything like, "Don't worry about it"?
They did. They tried to soothe me and to lecture me and encourage me to accept it. That one of the things they kept saying was animals don't feel pain. doesn't bother them like it bothers us, which we know today is a lie. But such is the culture of farming that there's a lot that's a lie and a lot that's in denial. As you go along and you mature, supposedly, you compartmentalize things. So I could see that horror and that cruelty and yet still sit down and eat a piece of meat and drink the milk. And at the same time, knowing that there was cruelty and suffering going on, there was the other side of it, and the other compartments, there was a lot of joy in being brought up on a farm because we had pets, we had dogs and cats, and we had pleasant moments, growing up and putting up the hay and hanging out with the animals in the barn and just good stuff. But at the same time, or at other times, you're forced to do these terrible things.
Yeah, I hear you. So then you went off to college away from home and you studied law and you became a lawyer. That kind of got you aware of other injustices and you became active in social activism. And then you met one of the first current or modern animal advocates, Peter Singer. Did you mention about
Yes.
that?
Well, I started college to become a doctor. I was a pre-med for a while. And after about 3 years of that, I realized that that did not appeal to me anymore. So I dropped out of college. And this was before the hippie days in the early 60s. And I just kind of bummed around and lived on a boat. And I got drafted and I served 2 years in the Army. And when I got out of the Army, I went back to school, this time because I was older and didn't have any money. I had to go to the state university, University of Missouri, which seems unbelievable to me today that I could go to school for free, because in those days, if you were a resident, you could go to the state university without paying tuition. All you had to pay was your books and your room and board and living expenses. So I went back to college and finished my college years. And at the time, I thought I would try law school. I didn't really have my heart set on being a lawyer and practicing law so much as I guess I wanted to please my family and prove to them that I wasn't a bum after all, and I could make it into law school. And I graduated from law school, and not wanting to practice in rural Missouri, I wanted to get away as far as I could. So I moved to Connecticut, where I took a job working in what was called legal services, which basically was a part of Lyndon Johnson's The War on Poverty program. There was federal money for offices to provide lawyers for low-income people. And I was in an office in Bridgeport, Connecticut. During that period, as a lawyer, I represented poor people, most of whom were people of color and Hispanic people, Puerto Ricans mostly. And I became familiar in representing them. I became as familiar as you could with the oppression and the discrimination that they faced. So I went from being sort of a white privileged country boy to being a city lawyer for people of color, and began to take on their interest and see that they got justice in the court system. So that was kind of an awakening for me. A political, social awareness developed. I became more aware of injustice to people. I wasn't quite into animal rights yet. It hadn't happened just yet. That was soon to come, though, because I did have a girlfriend at the time, and she belonged to a group called Friends of Animals. And I remember she told me I should join this group. So one day when I was in New York City, I dropped in the office of the group and ran into the founder and president, Alice Harrington. And she said, well, you could do some work for me sometime. So months later, she called me up and she wanted me to do some writing for her. And I wrote a pamphlet or two for Alice and Friends of Animals. And then about that time, we're getting in the early to mid 70s, Peter Singer, the author of Animal Liberation, was fresh out of Oxford University, and he was teaching at New York University. And he had written an essay that was published in the New York Review of Books. It caused quite a stir because in that essay, it was really a chapter from the book that became Animal Liberation. He argued about the equality of interests, that animals deserve equal consideration, that animals had rights for their life interests to be respected in the same way that we respected human rights. Coming as I did from a background as a lawyer representing the rights of oppressed people of color, of course, that appealed to me and took my interest. So Alice arranged that we should meet with Peter Singer. We talked to him at lunch, and we both, it turned out, were researching factory farming. He had already done quite a bit of work on the subject for the book that became Animal Liberation, and I was researching it for Alice Harrington. So we spent a lot of time talking to each other about what we knew about this then unknown development in agriculture that we call factory farming, which is where chickens and pigs and other animals are confined small spaces and managed more by machines than by human beings. So we had a lot in common, and we became friends, and that's how we came to be working on the book that became Animal Factories. That came out in 1980.
I'm aware that you also became vegan at the time. How did that transition happen?
Well, I must say, I didn't become vegan right away. And I've been vegan ever since I've had a memorable car ride with Peter. And I mentioned to him that I thought it amuses me now. It's probably okay to eat meat because that's what animals were for. What a strange thing it is for me now to admit that I thought that at one time. And you can imagine the response from Peter Singer, a philosopher who was already advanced and a vegan, when I, when I offered the rationale that that's what animals were for, which is such an absurdity. It's amazing that someone would actually believe that. But that's what I was taught. Now, we raised cows, pigs, and chickens and animals to be eaten, so it's okay to do so. So Peter, in a sentence or two, demolished that argument or the logic of it.
I know you wrote two other books besides An Unnatural Order. You wrote Animal Factories and The Ethics of What We Eat, Why Our Food Choices Matter. I recommend people check those out as well, but I would like to focus on An Unnatural Order.
Yes, please.
In the various editions, I noticed you have several slightly different variations on the subtitle. One is The Roots of Our Domination of Nature. One is The Roots of Our Destruction of Nature. Another is The Roots of Our Domination of Nature and Each Other. So I've combined them to be An Unnatural Order, The Roots of Our Domination and Destruction of Nature and Each Other. Any comments on that?
Just yesterday, I was talking with a friend about that title and subtitle. And I really argued with Martin Rowe, the publisher, that the subtitle should be, it should say An Unnatural Order, God, Sex, and Slavery. And he was appalled. He says, oh, we can't do that. You know, Martin is very proper English person, a scholar. But I thought God's, Sex, and Slavery would be much more punchy and much more to the point, and would like a shocking kind of appeal to people, because in a way, in a sense, that's what the book is about. It's about ideas about God, ideas about sex and gender, and of course, slavery, which the people would read the book, they realize that the enslavement of animals was the first form of slavery, which was rapidly copied by tribes of the people in the region in the Middle East when females, women and girls became the next subjects of slavery and traded as the same as they traded their livestock. I think it's safe to say that in that period, the female slaves were pretty much treated like another kind of livestock in those societies. And we're talking, you know, millennia ago, thousands before history begins, before the Sumerians, before the Egyptians. We're talking 5,000-6,000 BC, before there was writing and so forth. By the time history begins, about 3,000 BC, we already had female slavery and a lot of tribal warfare among the various farm city-states of the ancient Middle East, many of which are covered, so to speak, in the Bible. If you read some of the stories, how the Hebrews chased out the Canaanites and the Moabites and the Hittites, and their tribes are always chasing someone else out of land that they wanted. So there was a lot of intertribal warfare in the ancient Middle East by the time history begins, and patriarchy, of course, and slavery was a fixture in all of those cultures, whether they were the Hebrews or the Egyptians or the Assyrians, Sumerians, you name it, they were all similar.
I would urge Martin Rowe, your publisher, to definitely reconsider using that subtitle. I think it's quite powerful. It's got a punch, and it is an apt description of what the book is about.
Yes.
Your chapter headings lay out very clearly in an encapsulated form what the book is about, taking us step by step. As you point out in your book, what we consider history is just the time period after humans learned how to write his story, which was about 5,000 years ago or 3,000 years BC. I'll read the chapter headings now so people get a sense of how you lay that out. So it starts with dominionism identified, then before agriculture, a world alive and ensouled, animals, the most moving things in the world, agriculture, a new relationship with nature, a new world order for living things, misothery and the reduction of animals and nature, misogyny and the reduction of women and female power, racism and colonialism, dominating lands and others, rituals of dominionism then and now, and beyond dominionism. My fervent desire is that this interview will actually wake people up to where the whole human race veered off course. And by knowing that and understanding the roots of our domination and destruction of nature and each other, we can get back on that course of a just, loving, peaceful, sustainable, compassionate world and society.
Yes.
Would you go a little further into what the main theme and focus of the book is, and how it differs from other animal rights books, and how it reflects the statement, animal rights is human rights?
The germ of the idea for this book occurred to me as soon as I had published Animal Factories. My main object of curiosity at that time was the domestication process itself. How did cows and pigs and sheep come to be domesticated, that is, brought under human control? So I began to read a lot about the history of domestication of animals. And in the course of that reading, I ran across a book by a biologist, now passed, the late biologist Paul Shepard. And that book was Thinking Animals, the Evolution of Human Intelligence. And what he argues in that book is that animals are very important to us psychically and culturally. And we'll get to that chapter in the book in a minute. But with the two ideas in mind, one, the Shepard idea that animals were very important in the evolution of our minds and our intelligence. And the other idea being domestication, or what animal rights people call the enslavement of animals, the bringing of animals under human control. I thought at the time that this must have had a tremendous impact on the human mind and culture. How did we do this? If animals had been so important to us for hundreds of thousands of years, and all of a sudden we take control of them and we manipulate them and make them like tools for us, that must have had a disturbing effect on humanity and culture. So that's when I started writing An Unnatural Order in earnest. And I began taking notes, and it took me about 10 years of research and note taking to start constructing the chapter headings, which you just mentioned. Dominion is the dominion that's mentioned in the Holy Bible. God gave us dominion over the earth. Here's a God that, as it turns out, we invented this God to justify our uses of everything in the world around us. We invent a God that creates us to look like him, and it's a man. And then this God basically lays it all out for us and gives us dominion over it. The Bible does that 3 times. The Bible does that in the Garden of Eden, and then as soon as Adam and Eve are kicked out of the Garden of Eden, and then after Noah and after the flood. So 3 times God gives human beings dominion over the earth and the fish and the fowl and the birds of the sky. It's explicit. Dominion means a kind of ownership, as it were. So it's okay for us to use anything we want, which is the basis of the worldview that we're laboring under at the present time as we're destroying the planet. The idea that we can do anything we want because it was given to us, and we have a license to murder and to steal. So that's dominion. It's an idea of human supremacy of human exceptionalism, of human being special and not a part of the world, not a part of the animal world. It's the idea that really alienates us from being a part of the planet that created us. So it's the worldview, the paradigm which we're living under, more or less living under, and destroying the planet around us. I argue that it's the root cause of climate change and pollution and all the other disasters. The idea that we can do anything we want and there are no consequences because, we're above it. We're above it all. That's why we have to understand dominion. I might add, a lot of people, and when I've given talks, people are skeptical as to why is it important to go back thousands and thousands of years, right? What does this have to do with today? Why do I need to know about the domestication of sheep and goats in northern Syria, 10,000 years ago? And my answer is, well, because that was the beginning of the shaping of the worldview that we're suffering under today. That's where it all started. And if we really want to do something about climate change and all of the ways that we're destroying the planet, we need to understand, how did we come to see the world like this? And how did we come to see ourselves as some sort of owner and master of it all?
We've been talking with animal advocate, journalist, lawyer, public presenter, and amazing researcher and author of this book, An Unnatural Order: The Roots of Our Domination and Destruction of Nature and Each Other. The depths and the breadth of this book is mind-blowing. Thank you.